So today I'm going to share with you a little interview I did with a man named Captain Hunter. He is a former police officer turned activist and has a podcast called Captain Hunter's Podcast. So you got to check that out where podcasts are aired. But he was kind enough to let me share this interview that we did for his podcast. It is actually recorded May 1st. Of course, since that time, there's been a lot of the footage of Ahmaud Arbery, as well as the run with Ahmaud, and a lot of kind of awareness and just outcry about the case of the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And that relates to our interview. However, that outcry did not come until after we did this interview. So it's a related topic, and you'll kind of find some similar threads and themes throughout this. And then, I hope that you enjoy the little interview, and I will share a few thoughts at the end as well.
Definitely. So I want to thank you for coming on. We kind of jumped in here. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really, really appreciate it. I know you probably get, or tell me, you probably still get a lot of requests for interviews and things like that, I would assume, right?
All the time.
Okay.
I usually turn them all down unless there's something that seems to be like a fresh topic,
Okay.
Something that I haven't talked about 50 times already,
Okay.
So,
Very good. Well, then I'm definitely honored. Then thank you so much.
For sure.
So can you tell us what you've been up to within the last, we talked about how you're kind of dealing with this virus, but what else has been going on?
Well, before the virus, in some ways I feel like my social life has been in quarantine in a way for like the last 5 years, because I still haven't been able to get a job, at like I was teaching at the university and leading the Police Ombudsman Commission and the NAACP. I had 4 jobs when everything exploded in 2015, the whole media frenzy. So since then, I have not been able to get hired, here in Spokane. And of course, people, the obvious thing is like, why don't you relocate? And I will, but I had to wait until Franklin graduated high school, which he's now a senior, but I had to wait these 5 years in order to, get him graduated, because his dad is still in Idaho, and that's a whole custody situation. We've been divorced for 15 years. And so, I can't move more than 30 miles from the Idaho border with him, so I had to kind of stay here, see him through his high school. Who would have known that this was going to be the end of his senior year? It's a pandemic and no graduation ceremony, probably. But, they're talking about doing like a drive-in theater, like almost like a drive-in movie theater style graduation or something. There's so many crazy ideas, but nobody really knows what's happening with that. I'm kind of waiting for that graduation to happen, and then we will leave the area, and hopefully I can have a fresh start in a new space, because Spokane is really like the epicenter of a lot of the hostility, because my activism here was putting a lot of pressure on the city and the police department in particular for reform and for justice and for change. And so, like anytime you do that work, you make enemies, and they stay on your case. So I feel like once we get out of here, it'll be a fresh start. So I've just been doing hair and art in order to provide for my kids and keep the bills paid. So I have a website, Dolezal.com, where I sell my art. And then before the coronavirus pandemic, I was braiding hair and doing dreads and doing weaves, and I've been doing hair for 26 years. So everybody, there's always somebody who needs their hair done. So it's kind of like a good fallback skill to have in the absence of an official job. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's definitely true. My grandmother wanted me to become a barber because she said you can always eat, So, and I actually kind of regret that, not following through with that. Because I actually cut my kid's hair. I was actually pretty good at it, so I definitely could understand. But just standing up all day was just not for me.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about a couple of things here, and if I get off topic, please just kind of reel me back, and I promise this won't be a hit job. So let's talk about your activism there. And obviously that's going to relate back into a lot of your history and all that. So, but let's talk about your activism, how you got involved, why you got involved, and all that.
Yeah. So I know you come from a law enforcement background, right? So
correct, yes.
You know, Captain Hunter. So I'll definitely talk about the Spokane Police Department and my role as chair of the Police Ombudsman Commission. But before that, what really led up to that particular position was my activism in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, when I became the director of the Human Rights Education Institute in 2008. And it was actually November of 2008, the same month and year that Barack Obama was elected president the first time. So that being a hotbed for 5 white supremacy hate groups in North Idaho, it definitely had like a strong reaction to me being named the director of the institute. That's in that same moment, that same month and year. So that being said, the Human Rights Education Institute was born out of a lawsuit from the Southern Poverty Law Center sued the Aryan Nations. They had their international headquarters in Hayden, Idaho, which is a suburb of Coeur d'Alene, where the Education Institute is. And out of that, Greg Carr donated $1 million to start this institute as a preventative measure to, educate people about human rights so that this kind of international compound for white supremacy would never have a foothold in that area again. So that lawsuit bankrupted the Aryan Nations, pretty much shut them down. Then the Human Rights Education Institute was born. But there are several directors that ran the institute kind of more as like a kumbaya, feel-good human rights. It wasn't really making a palpable change in the community. And when I was named director, I actually got 50% of the salary of any previous white female or white male director in that role, because, they said that they felt like I was very passionate about the position, and that, if I proved myself, they said all these things. Well, fast forward to 2015, the board of directors actually was like, well, we perceived her to be African American. And I'm like, I know you perceived me to be African American in 2008 because you gave me a black woman's salary. You gave me 50%, so, but I didn't say, well, excuse me, I have white parents, so I could get the, full salary or something. Like, it was, I felt like that was a real understanding of my intentions in that position. I did intend to make a difference, and I did intend to, launch Black History programs and really actively oppose the white supremacy ideology that had a foothold in North Idaho. And so that's what I did. The Human Rights Education Institute actually grew from about 3,000 people or so being reached per year to about 30,000 people being reached per year in about 1.5 years of my leadership, and expanded regionally. So that's how Spokane, Washington kind of became part of that, is that I started the first ever Juneteenth celebration in North Idaho. And a lot of people from Spokane came and were really impressed with like the Buffalo Soldier presentations and the history exhibits, and just kind of like we had a cookout too, barbecue and all that kind of stuff. But I think that the quality and the content really impressed a lot of people in Spokane, and they wanted some of that same activism and leadership here. So when my oldest son, Isaiah, who's now in the UK doing his master's degree, but at the time, when he graduated high school in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, I then relocated to Spokane because I was teaching at Eastern Washington University and at North Idaho College. And so I decided to move all of my teaching work to Eastern Washington University and just moved to Spokane. So we moved here in 2013, and my activism then kind of started shifting because, as I'm sure you're aware, like 2012 to 2014 was really the time when Black Lives Matter became, a national movement and got a lot of traction. Trayvon Martin being killed to 2014, Michael Brown being killed. The 2012 and 2014, like those are kind of like the two, big years of that movement. And so I really felt passionate about joining the specific cause of holding police accountable for police brutality and use of force issues with Black youth, for the reason that my sons, both, my two older sons, now I have a third son who's 4, but at the time, they were in that danger zone for age, and especially Isaiah, he was the same age as Trayvon, the same weight, the same height. Skittles was his favorite candy. I mean, it was like when Trayvon was killed, that felt like my son was at risk. It was like a state of emergency for mother who, connected their Black sons with that situation. And so there was a kind of a uprising and a call for some type of police reform in Spokane because there was actually the case of Otto Zem, and I don't know if you've heard of that, but it was a disabled guy, and he was white, but he had a disability, and he didn't understand that the officers were telling him to put his hands up, and so I think he was buying a candy bar or something. Anyway, he was shot and killed, and there was kind of like this, sense of community uprising, like we have to have a community oversight commission. So they called a panel discussion, and I don't know if you're familiar with Norm Stamper.
Yeah.
So Norm came up to hold kind of it was at the downtown theater. We had a big event, and he was the speaker, and then there was a representative of the sheriff, Ozzie Knezovich, was there, and the SPD, and then also a city councilman, and then they had one community representative, which was me, on the panel, and they did not take any questions from the audience. So I was kind of tasked with fighting for the people, on state, versus the sheriff and the police department and the city councilman, and then. I felt like Norm Stamper and I were kind of on the same page, but we didn't really know each other that well. So he actually had been a supervisor for my dad, and of course, my non-biological father, because since everybody thinks it's their business. Albert Wilkerson, was my father figure, right? So he was a police officer in San Diego under Norm Stamper, actually. So he joined the police force as a Black officer. Right after the Rodney King situation, all the officers left the force, and then, he kind of felt like, we don't, like having an all-white police force is not the answer. So he wanted somebody to be present for the community on the force. So he joined, became a police officer, and then experienced a lot of racism within the police force, and ended up, leaving that role. But Norm. He respected Norm because Norm was really fighting against that racism within the police force. And anyway, long story short, that situation with me representing the community, I feel like really labeled me as a regional activist and community spokesperson that would be willing to stand up to the police. And so in 2014 is when the commission finally had their first elections, and people could apply, and several different groups, kept asking me, like, you need to, we want you as a commissioner on this ombudsman commission. And I said, I'm busy. I've got like a lot going on. People were also asking me to run for president of the NAACP because the outgoing president or the incumbent was kind of running the organization into the ground. They were at risk of being shut down by the regional umbrella office because they owed fines, for fees, and didn't have any active committees. And so there was kind of, people were kind of asking me, like, we need you to step up in Spokane like you did when you were in Coeur d'Alene. And I said, I'd be happy to, but I don't know if I could do both of those positions because that's a lot to take on because both positions were unpaid. So, and either one, president of NAACP or the chair of the Police Ombudsman Commission could be like a full-time job. Like there's a lot of work. We had to go to conferences in California, in Seattle, police accountability conferences. I was working with the Department of Justice, with Obama's collaborative reform strategy. Las Vegas was isolated as a kind of experimental or model big city, and then Spokane was used as like a test grounds for a mid-sized city for the Department of Justice to see if they could really institute that collaborative reform, changing police culture strategy. So I was working with the Department of Justice and also, as the chair of the Police Ombudsman Commission, and then, I didn't even actually put my name on the ballot for the NAACP position, but because the president was running unopposed, the treasurer and secretary put my name on the ballot in that meeting. I wasn't present, and I found out about it, and I left it there. Like I didn't withdraw my name, but I ended up being elected then, and having those two positions, which the Spokane Police Department really did not like. The chief of police was very cynical about me being in both of those roles because he felt like I had an anti-police bias, and he also felt like it was like a conflict of interest to represent the NAACP and the Police Ombudsman Commission simultaneously. So anyway, all of that kind of came to a head in 2015 when 13 white male officers hauled in Lorenzo Hayes, a black man, to the Spokane County Jail and killed him. They threw him to the ground, he vomited, and they held him down and he asphyxiated in his own vomit. And he was a father of 7 children. They said he was drugged up, and the family said that was not the case. He actually was brought in or arrested simply because there was a protection order in place with his fiance, and she showed up to his house, and the neighbors, she's white, he's black, the neighbors called the cops because they knew about the protection order and they were scared for her. So they called the cops, and he was at his own home, but he ended up getting arrested for violating the protection order because she showed up and they're in the same space, or whatever. So he actually was just kind of like at home, and then he ends up being arrested, and then he ends up being killed. And so there's a lot of stuff in the press about how he was a drug dealer and he was high at the time. And when the autopsy actually came back, there are no drugs in his system. I had seen the video where he was held down and, killed. And I believed it was a homicide. The chief of police told me, this is not a Black Lives Matter moment. Don't talk about it. You can't, keep quiet, basically. And I didn't. And that went into investigation in the summer of 2015. And that's, when The police actually had a private investigator following me. And then I also was fighting for a court case for my little sister who was sexually assaulted by her older brother. And he also had molested me. We're the only two girls in the family. And she's adopted, and I'm his biological sister. So as long as, I was her key witness and I held all these respectable positions in the community, he would have gone to prison as a child molester, because I broke the tie of a he said, she said. And that case was in Colorado. So this is all happening. The trial was that summer as well. So these two things kind of were colliding, where I was advocating for her. I was advocating for Lorenzo Hayes, and the police had a private investigator following me, and my biological parents had a private investigator following me, and they connected. And there was this big explosion about, is Rachel black or white? And honestly, I would have never guessed that anybody, I could see it being a small time little scandal locally, but that the whole world would actually care one way or the other. I would have never thought that would have been an issue, because I'm just a normal person. I was focused on the work. I never made it a point to, my identity was never my focus. That's my private, that's my situation, that's my privacy. And I just never was focused on that as much as doing the work. So I was so busy doing the work that they kind of came in and derailed all of that. So the city they removed me from the commission because they said that it was an ethics violation that I had marked white, black, and native on the form where, for this volunteer position, which on the form it said black, having human origins, in African, in the continent of Africa or something, having origins in the continent of Africa. That's everybody. We're all the black human race. We all go back to a black mother in Africa. It's just, some people are not aware of that, but I have taught African history, and I've also taught 15 courses at the university level on race and culture, and I know that race is a social construct that we enact, and to perpetuate oppression and racism. So anyways, all of that to say that they use that as a tool to undo the whole commission. They didn't just remove me. They removed 3 out of 5 commissioners, my vice chair, and also Adrienne, who was, Kevin and Adrienne were probably the 2 most vocal and radical next to me on the commission. And so the other 2 were very passive, and they left them. But 3 out of 5 commissioners were removed. That made the commission just be in jeopardy and basically be ineffective, throughout the entire investigation, in which case the highway patrol had to investigate because it was at the county, at the jail where Lorenzo Hayes was killed. So that was under sheriff. But the Spokane Police Department officers brought him in and were the ones who physically killed him. So then it was the chief of police and the sheriff who both had their necks on the line. So the highway patrol investigated as the 3rd branch of law enforcement. They ruled that it was in fact a homicide. However, when the county prosecuted it, the county prosecutor argued that there was no malice when they killed him. So everybody walked off free. There were no consequences.
Yeah, that's really, really disturbing.
Yeah. And my sister's case was dismissed because I was, there's this whole hype about me being a liar. That language was used for a reason in order to discredit my testimony for her case. And so, it basically justice for my sister, a black woman, Lorenzo Hayes, a black man, many other cases that were also in process through the different active committees of the NAACP chapter here were unraveled and shut down. So that's the effect that that was intended, you know, by the white parents, by the white chief of police, by the white media, you know, like everybody who conspired together to make that happen knew what they were doing, but what they crafted was a scandal or a controversy that would make both sides, white and black, you know, hate me or, you know, come against me or oppose me, so that they could meanwhile pass all this stuff through. So it was kind of like a big distraction. Like, look over here and, you know, oh my gosh, she has white parents, which, like, how would that be news? But it became news, you know? And then, meanwhile, these issues of justice were dismantled.
Yeah. Why do you think that the world cared? I mean, you talked about, you know, you having white parents. Why do you think that is such a big deal for people, as far as the whole passing type of thing?
Because of the narrative in which it was delivered. Because the white parents went on every national TV network within 24 hours, ABC, Fox, CNN, NBC, and said, you know, our daughter is a liar and a fraud. And so, you know, like, who wouldn't hate a liar and a fraud? You know, like, that doesn't sound good. So from that kind of standpoint, then it, like, opened the floodgates for everybody to, you know, come in. And basically I was, you know, I was taking punches. And it was created in order, like, it was set up for that to happen. Is
right.
What I'm saying. You know, like, that was the intention, and that's exactly what happened. And my credibility was destroyed. All 20 years fighting for civil rights work was called into question, you know, because there have been a lot of, you know, infiltrators or people with ulterior motives or people who, you know, culturally appropriate for benefits or for money or for fame or for whatever. And that was not me, but that has happened in history. And there's a history of people taking advantage of the black community in order to leverage themselves. And so, you know, there's this whole kind of almost caricature or personality created in the absence of knowing who I actually really am and what I was actually really doing. People were just going off of what the parents said, and then what the media, you know, the media loved that, so they were like hyping it up. And then it was kind of like opinions about opinions, and people could care less really about the real Rachel. They just cared about voicing their opinion about the topic of race and identity. And they're kind of like using me as an example, like, of what not to do and what not to be, without even knowing, you know, what I was actually about. So, yeah.
So growing up in Montana, right? That's where you grew up at.
Yeah.
Growing up in Montana, town and everyone you're around is lily white, mm-hmm. And so you begin to identify as black. At what point did you start to see that there was a disparity, racism? At what point did you start to understand that black people were treated differently, and therefore leading you to go on this crusade? I mean, you talked about your son, and I want to get into your son and how he went to high school and stuff. But at what point in your life did you understand that I'm living in this racially constructed world, and that African Americans are essentially on the lower end of the totem pole?
Yeah. So actually, before I got to that point, when I was 4 years old, in this all-white environment, basically, it was a small town of 3,000 people, so it's pretty, you know, I was born on the side of a mountain in a little teepee, which is, like, really weird. The only witness to my birth is listed as Jesus Christ, which is even more weird. So,
well, maybe he was there, so I don't know.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know. I grew up there was no TV. We had no TV in the house. I had no, like, input before I went to public school. I had no social input on any kind of, like, racial divide or anything like that. So my first instinct was, as a little girl, like, I drew everybody was with the brown crayon. Like, that was what was beautiful to me. So when I did my first self-portrait, I had brown skin and curly black braids, and I was happy. I was smiling in that picture. But the reaction is really what taught me that my instinct as, like, black is beautiful, and like, this is something to be celebrated, was punished. Like, that was not the norm. Like, people did not accept that expression. I learned that at age 4.
Well, how did you? Well, there's two questions I have about that. How did you get to that point? I mean, no TV, not seeing anyone. How did you even know to do that? And how did you know?
I was 4. Right. It just came from within. Like, that was my expression. I mean, you are 4 years old. You don't have an explanation for it. You can't, like, go into a philosophical thing about why do you dance. If I danced, I would get punished for that because women weren't supposed to, girls aren't supposed to move your body. I mean, there are all these things that that came natural to me that were censored and punished. And so I learned to repress that, but I was allowed to read books. And so, because we didn't have TV, I was allowed to, we had books, we had a library, a public library. And so as I got older, I gravitated toward Black history books. And I mean, that's just, like, where I really just felt like at home. And I love to read stories, like personal narratives, autobiographies. And, I grew up in poverty. So I think part of the fact that I was like a lesser kid at school because we didn't have name brand clothes. So I started, like, at 9 years old. I started working and earning money and buying my own clothes and shoes, and so that I could not be a social outcast, basically. And so I felt like, like, I wanted Nike shoes. I was never going to get Nike shoes unless I got a job at 9 years old and bought my own shoes. So I felt like, as a girl, I also was a second-class citizen in my household because it was not only poor, but it was also very patriarchal and very religious, and so women had no say. And I think there was a common thread, like, when I read Black history books as a preteen and as a young, as a child, I was finding more connection in, like, the whole silver spoon life that the white people seem to have in those scenarios in the South. Like, I didn't have any experience with that. I didn't have things handed to me. I also was beaten, with, it was an abusive household. So I could relate to, like, corporal punishment and being punished for something that you didn't even know what you did wrong, but you're just being punished basically for existing. That's how I felt as a child. So I got punished frequently, and whether it was for being a girl or in the instances of sexual assault, if I would talk about it or try to, bring it up, I was, and my sister had a similar experience. Like, we would get our mouths rinsed out with soap, have to sit at the table, write out scripture verses about what God will do to liars, So there's a lot of, like, trauma connected to even being called a liar in that family, connected to sexual assault of the older white brother who, is still protected by the parents, and he got to still keep his job, even though he was arrested and indicted. And the judge at the last hearing had said that, she believed my sister, that in fact more than 30 instances of sexual assault had in fact occurred.
Wow.
And when she was age 6 and 7, and he was 26 and 27 at the time. I was 2 years younger than him, so there's a little bit of a different dynamic. But the idea in general that we're both girls and could just be used was a theme of that household. Like we were basically property or subservient to the man. So the oppression in Black history definitely vibed with some of what the struggle that I felt as a girl, you know, and trying to heal from oppression. And of course, it's history is a different time, different place, different scenarios. It's not the same, but it's a theme, you know, that you can like connect with. If you know pain, then you connect with stories of pain. You know, if you have had a blissful life, then you probably seek out the happy stuff. I never really felt like I had a happy life, so I was always like wanting to protect somebody else from the pain that I experienced. And so when I was 14, my parents adopted 4 Black kids because they wanted to not pay taxes because they had some kind of call from God about the pro-life issue. And if they adopted a certain number of kids, then they could actually make money on tax returns. Well, doing God's work to save kids from abortion, and Black kids were the cheapest because a white kid was like $55,000 to adopt, and a Black kid was, you know, a few $100 if you wanted to adopt one from Haiti, and about $5,000 or $4,000 if you want to adopt a kid from Chicago. And so they got 4. And I homeschooled through all of my high school years because I was the main caregiver for all of my siblings. Because my mom supposedly she was self-diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, which always reminded me of that, like, the white lady on the porch in the plantations, you know, that need her glass of lemonade. And then I'm sitting here raising all the kids, you know, and doing all the work, cooking, everything. And
she was tired from watching you.
and I was also teaching myself trigonometry, biology, all these high school subjects, and mailing all my assignments to this private school in Illinois or Indiana, Arlington Heights, Indiana. And so it was like I was up at 5 in the morning and I was working till 10 at night, you know, from 14 years on. But it was kind of a continuation of working, you know, back when I was 9 years old. Like, I felt like I always was atoning for who I was, and I didn't really understand, like, exactly what that meant, but I was always, like, just working my ass off, basically, and taking care of people. So, fast forward to 2015, or actually, you know, 2012 to 14, we're talking about the Trayvon to Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, I mean, all of the names of Black Lives Matter movement, but Isaiah being my oldest son. So what happened there was Isaiah was one of those little babies in Montana, and he came home at 2 weeks old. He ended up reaching out to me because the parents were getting rid of all of their kids when they started to become teenagers. They started to, they put my sister in a group home. They put my brother Zach in a group home. So they got rid of, you know, and Isaiah reached out to me and he was like, get me out of here. You know, I don't want to be institutionalized. And also, you're my real mom because you have been the one that's been there for me my whole life. And, you know, so I sued my parents for child abuse and won custody of Isaiah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so he became my oldest son. And that's, you know, and then, of course, you know, raising him, that also was, once I got custody of him, it was at that point that I no longer just was ambiguous about my identity, because before that, it was about 15 years of, since college, people being like, oh, she's mixed, and then somebody else would be like, no, she's white, and then somebody, and I didn't really care. Like, I was like, whatever you want to call me, do you, you know, I'm just going to live my life and show by my actions what I'm about. But when I got custody of Isaiah, it became a little more serious because he did not want people to know his backstory of being adopted by this abusive white family. And he just wanted to fit in. You know, as a 13-year-old, he just wanted to fit in and be a normal kid. And so I was like, yeah, that's only going to work if nobody ever, you know, is like, oh, she must be white, and because Isaiah's not mixed. So he's just kind of like a mid-tone complexion, and like if I'm a light-skinned black woman, that works. Like nobody's gonna question. So in throughout his counselors and stuff would just, you know, they'd ask me about like what was it like being a teen mom, and I was like, oh, it was busy, you know, which was true because little did they know I actually have 4 babies when I was, you know, working my way through high school, but I didn't give birth to him biologically. But I wanted to protect him, like he is my son, period. And it's nobody's business, you know, that he's not my biological son. It's just not anybody's business. So people just thought that he and Franklin had different dads. And once again, like in social situations, I think there's this assumption that at some point you just spelled it out and was like, I'm going to identify as black, or I'm going to say, you know, this or that. But it happens very gradually. And people just make like visual associations and assumptions when they see your family. You know, they're like, oh, you know, this is your oldest son. This is your youngest son. Okay, you know, one's a little darker than the other one, so they must have different dads. You know, I mean, it just was like socially easier to just let people assume that, and it also kept Isaiah protected from all those super personal questions that would bring back all that trauma from the past. So, you know, on his 21st birthday in 2015 is when all this exploded, and I remember him sitting on the couch and just crying like, why can't somebody wish me a happy birthday? Because all his high school friends were calling him and being like, you lied to us, that wasn't your mom. And he's like, yes, she is my mom. So there's all this, you know, because people felt betrayed by really what they had assumed too. Like, you know, if people see something and they assume something, they found out later, they're like, well, but you should have told me. And it's like, but it wasn't your business to know that personal backstory, really. So I guess, you know, I mean, I can see how it all kind of, like I said, I could see it becoming a little bit of a tense situation locally just because of all of that. But once again, I felt like it should never have become like a national phenomenon or global phenomenon.
Yeah, I think, and that's what I mean, that's a good question. So I remember a friend of mine, we were, when this all kind of thing exploded, he texted me and asked me what I thought about this whole situation. And I really didn't have much to say about it, but I thought that what was interesting is the phenomenon, because there are black people who, for the sake of argument, you know, naturally born real black people who intentionally pass for being white because they all the time. So the question is why would someone, and you wrote this in your book, why would someone, you know, want to be something else? And that is so difficult. And so that once again, it sheds light on the problem of race, is that one group and class of people are considered the standard, right? The good, the standard, and the other class of people are considered lesser than. And so I think that your case really shines a light on that. And that's and I really hope that people would see that. Not just, okay, this perpetrating you as whatever, fraud or whatever, but it's really the fraudulence of America, and that we claim to be an equalitarian society,
right.
And yet when something like this happens, we see what's going on. Same thing we talked about at the beginning about the coronavirus and how it sheds light on what's really going on in this problem. You have a unique perspective because growing up in Montana, well, I don't know, you tell me, did you see and hear what certain people really think about African Americans. I would assume that you've probably heard that at some point in time before. Even when you were raising when you got the poor sisters and brothers, you saw what people, they want to touch them, they're enamored by them or whatever.
I didn't see that before my brothers and sisters.
Okay.
Because
right. Once
there was no black population in Montana, in Troy, Montana, before our family, So actually, the first experience I had was with hair, and it was a couple years before the oldest of the little siblings was adopted, and there's a little girl in the neighboring town that was adopted, and she was mixed, but she had like really black hair, like she didn't have some kind of mixed hair texture. Her texture of hair was very kinky curly, and so nobody knew how to work with her hair, and I immediately started researching. Again, I went to books because I didn't have TV. I went to books and magazines, and I started looking at hairstyles, and because I was concerned about her self-esteem, and growing up in a white household, and she had a white sister that was also adopted. But anyway, to this day, actually, so I started doing her hair. That's how I started braiding, and that was 26 years ago. So she's now 26. She actually flew me down to Florida to do her hair for her wedding a few years ago, and all of her bridesmaids and everything. But anyway, so she was kind of my first braid client, and I researched. I mean, I knew so many hair products, and back then it was the pink lotion and stuff. Nobody uses that anymore. So yeah, it was. I did cornrows and braids and beads, and what I did is I just looked at pictures and would just replicate it, and it's just all practice. It's like art. It's a hand-eye coordination thing. So that was my first time when it wasn't so much that people were being mean to her. But I did notice that people were trying to touch her hair, and then also that she was kind of withdrawing because, she didn't want them to, but she also just didn't feel confident about her hair. So that was my first experience with that. And then of course, when my siblings came along, I felt very protective toward, taking 4 babies into the grocery store, like we were pretty visible everywhere we went because it's oh, there's the 4 black kids, and people would assume that they could say things or do things. I taught my siblings and I taught my children, you don't let people touch your hair because it's part of your body, and you don't let a stranger touch your kid's body. So they don't get to touch their hair, without consent either. And so it was kind of I felt like, and I'm sure you read about that in the book, just, at that point, I was going into protective mode whenever anybody would come at my little siblings. When I went to Mississippi, though, in college is kind of when things shifted for me more towards, people are really not seeing me as a white person. In the South, I really was not like any of the white Southerners. And so, I became the historian of the Black Student Union. I got the first African American history course started on campus, and all these things that everybody's okay, we know that you're the main explanation was she's got to be part black because no white person ever does any of this stuff. So that's just the only thing that makes sense, or else she's reincarnated from she's a black person in the past life, but there is no some people thought I was an albino, some people thought I was mixed, some people, and I just kind of once again I didn't really at that point self-assert. As you know from my book, I didn't realize that anthropologically race is not real and it's a social construct until I was at Howard in graduate school. That's when I first realized that race is a lie. This whole thing is a lie. You can't even lie of lie? You know, like, is it more of a lie to say because white is a whole, like James Baldwin said, that, you know, there aren't any white people, they're just people that think they're white. So it's like, when you really start thinking about it, it's more accurate if you want to actually honor, you know, our ancestry, honor African origins of civilization. It's more accurate to claim membership of the Black human race, you know. And then, of course, yes, there's a longer explanation of, you know, how you came through, you know, migration to this point, but that still doesn't necessarily represent the mind and the spirit. You know, that's just the journey of the body and your genetics, but it's not necessarily like, you know, your mind and your spirit. So Dick Gregory said, you know, race is a state of mind. So like being Black is a state of mind, being white is a state of mind. And if you really get into the weeds on it, I really think that people could have had an opportunity for a very powerful dialogue about race in 2015, but we kind of missed that opportunity because everybody is too busy being entertained with all these jokes and all this, you know, these assumptions and crazy.
I agree. I totally agree. Why do you think that a lot that your parents, or you probably don't want to call them that, Lawrence and what was your biological?
Yeah.
Yes.
The biological folks.
Yes, the biological folks. Why do you think that they wanted to institutionalize these boys? And you talked a little bit about the psychology of that. Do you think that the boys or the teenagers, as they were acting out against the social world that they were being raised in?
Yeah, I think that the simple answer to that is that they're racist. And, you know, as soon as these kids started being big enough to not be able to whoop and control, I mean, these parents, they beat these kids with baboon whips. Like, Isaiah had scars on his back from being whipped. Like, not just whooped, you know, whipped. So
with an eye.
That's how I got, you know what I'm talking about. Like, that's how I got custody of him. And that's something that is completely unacceptable, and something I can never forgive, is the trauma they inflicted, you know, not only on me but on my siblings. And that's just, you know, so as soon as they became too big to beat enough to submit or into, you know, then they just figured like they had to get rid of them. You know, they sent them to these Christian reform, like Zach went to this Christian reform camp that basically like they do like shock therapy, like electric shock therapy, all kind of crazy things. Like he had a bad back at like 16, you know, from building too many fences and stuff. I mean, it was just, I think he and my sister were like one of the only Black kids at either of these facilities, which was probably nothing new to them given where they grew up, you know. But still, it was like they had no Black hair care products either. It was like Dove soap or Ivory soap and Dove shampoo and like not even any conditioner. So like my sister's hair just like broke off throughout her. So yeah, it was just a matter of control. They couldn't control the kids anymore. They literally, Larry Ruthann is short as I'm tall. I'm as tall as Larry, and I'm the tallest woman in the whole family. So Ruthann's like 5'1", maybe 5 foot 5'1". He's like 5'3", 5'4". So they're short. You know, they're a short couple. Just to kind of like give a bit. So the kids started to outgrow the parents. At like by age 13, they're starting to get taller than these folks, and the folks again, they're a little bit old. They're getting tired of eating everybody.
Right. So
you know, and they also, another layer to that is that they didn't really have like real jobs. Like they were so-called missionaries to South Africa, and then, you know, in Georgia, these in Colorado, and so they would do this newsletter where they put all these little Black, you know, the little kids' faces. So when they're babies, they would get a lot more donations for saving these poor black children from abortion and everything. And then as they start getting older, those little faces, as you know, there's that age of, for black youth, there's that age of adulthood, perceived adulthood comes, from the white gaze comes a little sooner. Like at age 13, 14, there's that perception of threat, or of, being grown, whereas like we still see them as kids. Like until like my 18-year-old is a kid to me, but at the same time, I realize that when he steps outside, he's not going to be seen as a child by anybody else,
Right.
on the street. So yeah, that was kind of the situation there, and it was terrible, and I felt a lot of guilt even going to college. I didn't know how to I didn't want to abandon my siblings, but I also had no rights to remove them from that situation until I got out of college and actually had, something stable to offer them. So.
Do you have any anti-police bias? You're accused of that by the former chief there in Spokane.
I am critical. I wouldn't say I'm anti-police. I mean, like I said, my dad, Albert Wilkerson, may he rest in peace. He died a year and a half ago. You probably read his foreword that he wrote in my book.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's passed now, but he was a police officer. I don't feel like I have I'm critical of the police, but
you're struggling to answer this question. You don't have to struggle. Just be honest.
But I don't know that I'm like anti-police just across the board, because I do know there are some good officers. Unfortunately, though, I do feel like the culture of policing in many areas is not healthy. It's not balanced, and yes, it is racist. And I experienced that I went through the whole use of force training with the police department here. I went on ride-alongs at night with the officers, and I noticed that, like in the use of force training, for example, every time you had to either shoot or be shot, it was a person of color. And
wait, so the training was like a video, and they
it's
put
like
someone
it's a virtual, like it's a video game that you're standing in the middle of with like a gun thing,
Right.
So it's like all these big screens, and then you're like, yeah, it's called a virtual training. And so these different, you're trying to talk to the person, you're trying to like de-escalate, and then it's not working, and then you have to make a judgment call on whether you shoot or whether you don't shoot, and if you don't shoot, then you get shot.
Right.
And so it trains officers to shoot, and it's, in my opinion, I felt like the training could have been improved, and that was part of what I was trying to work with the Department of Justice. I also feel like this is something that maybe is just specific to Spokane, but once again, there's a policy here that is very racist, a racial profiling policy that if you move to Spokane from Chicago or LA and you are either black or Hispanic, you get immediately gang affiliated on, like, you get attached a gang affiliation. It'll come up on, like, if you get pulled over or something, it'll come up on that little screen in the cop car that you're gang affiliated. Even if there's no evidence that you're gang affiliated, you just have to be black or Hispanic from Latino from the LA area or from Chicago area, and it's immediate. So
wow.
I feel like, things like that are just straight up racial profiling. Like, you could have moved here from Chicago as a lawyer. Isaiah, my oldest son, he was born in Chicago, and he's, connected to his biological parents there now. But, like, once again, things like that, I feel very passionate that that's not a gray area. That's pretty clear that that's wrong. And the fact that Spokane cops also had 220 body cameras, but we're only wearing 19 of those because it was optional, things like that. I don't say I'm like anti-police, think every police officer is a bad person, but but I think that the culture in policing needs to be changed, and I am critical of that. There are only like 3 black officers in Spokane, and one of those, was like, I mean, he would tell me things, but he's like, you can't tell anybody these things because if you do, they're gonna know it's one of 3 of us that said it, And there was
how large is the force out there? How many people on the force?
I can't even really remember. I'm sure you can probably find that on Google. It's mid-sized city. Spokane's mid-sized city, and there's a division between, of course, the city, police department and the county, the sheriff, but there's some kind of overlap there. Neither one is really, in my opinion, best practice. Let's put it like that. But yeah, so there's kind of just, there are some things that I really wanted to work to change. The black officers would tell me that there are certain cops they would not go on a call with because they were afraid for their life. If they went on a call, like, they might become a casualty at that event, So, yeah, that's pretty deep. People were scared, and one of the officers, he's like, you realize you're the most hated woman in Spokane by the police department. And I'm like, I know, and you're like, I know what I'm signing up for, and somebody's got to do this work, because my kids are growing up here, so I'll be damned if I don't, I take a bullet for my kids. Like, I thought something was gonna happen, like, all these incidents of break-ins, maybe something was gonna happen to me physically. I didn't actually foresee a media scandal being the way that I was actually taken down. But one of the older gentlemen here, who's lived here 50 years, he said there have only been 3 black leaders, 4. He was actually including me. He said 3 other black leaders that rose to the level of municipal threat with the city. All 3 of those other people were taken down through a media scandal. 2 of them committed suicide, and 1 moved away. Because you cannot come back here after that. Like, there's no way to come back. So, if I would have known that history, then I maybe would have guessed the routine. But it's not just in Spokane. That's happened with activists in many places across the nation. Some form of, personal attack or scandal or media thing or whatever, and then their leadership is undone. Therefore, the work is undone. It's a strategy that's repeated, throughout history.
What do you think is necessary? We talked about you want to change police culture. How is that going to be accomplished? Is it possible? Am I just spinning my wheels? Are you spinning your wheels? Can we really get change in the majority of police departments? Or not even, I don't even know if it's the majority. In some police departments.
In one? One somewhere? Well, see, that was the goal, was if we could reform Spokane as a mid-sized city model, then we could duplicate that in other places. That was my vision, and other people's vision that were involved in that process. But, I think it's going to take collective action. I don't know if I'm an optimist, but I really do have a strong sense of hope that if people get off their couches and, do something, and most importantly, are willing to make a sacrifice, it will cost you something. And I think a lot of people just don't want to count that cost. They don't want to risk a media scandal. They don't want people picking into their personal life. They don't want to put their neck out too far, And so people kind of stay comfortable. And if we're going to stay comfortable and safe, and just make a teeny little bit of change, then no, it's never going to change. Like, we have to make pretty drastic change. And I think kind of like quickly and with some momentum in order for change to actually happen. So it's possible. Is it likely? No, but it's possible. So it's still worth pushing for, in my opinion. But I think we have to be organized, strategic, and gosh, that collaborative reform model with Obama, I felt like had a lot of potential. If people were willing to put in the local work and the state work, that could have really, gone somewhere. I don't think it has gone anywhere. Of course, now we have Trump, and now it's, like things, now we have coronavirus. People get so easily distracted. Like, where is Black Lives Matter movement? I mean, people, that's like so, 5 years ago,
Well, I reached out to them. Maybe they'll listen to this. I reached out to them. I wonder if they're still around. All that. So,
well,
I'd like to know them.
I mean, I feel like everybody is, on a personal level, we can all carry that mission and that cause forward, on our social media, with the people we talk to. We can all encourage and elevate the idea of Black lives being worthy and important and mattering. Like that can be underscored, but as a visible cause, I feel like that takes some leadership, and there's got to be somebody visibly, leading that, organizing events, things like that. And now in the case of coronavirus, it's like a lot of this. I just did a guest lecture for Activist Graduate School. I don't know if you've heard of them, but Michael White is the kind of organizer of that. It's an online graduate school for activists. And, I talked about, just kind of like some of the new strategies that we've got to draw from, like online digital stuff. I mean, there's all this surveillance that's going to become a big issue too, with whether it's privacy, and then we know that surveillance doesn't cut evenly. Usually that happens, the stop and frisk and the surveillance stuff was an issue targeting mostly Black and brown communities. So, we've got to keep all these things in check, and there's always a way to fight for more justice, even if it's by degrees. I think we've got to keep the fight going.
Very good. Well said. Well said. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I really, really appreciate it. I really, really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
You said you want to put this on your podcast, on your YouTube. Is there any question you want to ask me? Or it's okay.
I do have a lot of questions for you. I have another call that I have to do coming up.
No problem.
But yeah, I love this topic. I think we could do a part 2.
Oh, absolutely.
Maybe I can interview you next time. Just, like what you think is possible, what you see as strategies that have worked or could work to change the culture of policing. And especially since you have that background, I think, it takes somebody who knows what's going on the inside to really understand, like, what needs to be fixed, which is, I'm not a cop. I've never been a cop, but I did take, hundreds of hours of going through, the trainings and everything, because I wanted to understand and do an effective job in my little unpaid position that became so controversial.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, we can definitely do a part 2, and I'd be more than happy to answer that and get into that. So.
All right. Sounds good.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'll reach out again. So
all right.
Thank you so much. Take care of yourself. Okay.
Take care too. Bye.
So I hope you enjoyed that little short interview with Captain Hunter. And if you have any questions, let me know. I also wanted to just mention that today I saw a little news story about Breonna Taylor, an update. So Breonna Taylor was a decorated EMT, and she's in Louisville, Kentucky. And she was shot 8 times in her own bed at, I think, 1 a.m. in the morning. And it was a narcotics search warrant, I believe, and there were no drugs found in the house. And her and her boyfriend were surprised in the middle of the night by police breaking in or entering their home. And so there's kind of like some more details around that, but she was shot 8 times and killed. And I hear that the same attorney who represented the firm that represented Trayvon Martin's case is also connected with Ahmaud Arbery's case and with Breonna Taylor's case now. So good luck to that firm. And once again, it's not, for those of you who wonder, like, why is each name so important? Why is it such a big deal? It's because each individual case represents, and each individual life represents a much larger situation. Is connected to not only history, the history of lynching in America, the history of devaluing Black lives all the way back to the Constitution, the 3/5 clause, through chattel slavery in America, through the Jim Crow era, through the gentrification and the disproportionalities in discipline in public schools that still persist, and so many other things, the whole civil rights movement, of course. But now we have the Black Lives Matter movement that seems to kind of be getting a little bit of a recharge during this Ahmaud Arbery information and case and the outcry from that. But I think that it's so important to push through justice. There was not justice for Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman is still at large. And I think that each case is important, not only because it's connected to history, but also because it is connected to our future. If there is justice, if there are consequences for these actions at the level of homicide, murder, and hate crimes, then it sends a signal that this is not going to be something that is okay to repeat in the course of American life and society. And so that's really the way that this gets shut down, is to send a strong signal that, justice will be served, Black lives will be deemed as valuable, equally valuable to any other lives, and that basically human life in America is equitable, it's equal across the board. And that needs to be something that is once and for all established, defended, litigated, and proven to be true. And until that is proven to be true, probably over and over a few different times, because this is going to, again, need to be a signal sent enough times to undo all of those old habits and patterns of racism and of racial bias and racial profiling and bigotry that have persisted for hundreds of years in the United States. So this is something that we have to keep the momentum going for. And every phone call, every letter to Governor Kemp, to legislators, to the attorneys that are fighting, to the family, to support every attempt to reach out, every effort to gain justice does matter, does count. And so I just hope that everyone watching this is able to, support the cause and keep the momentum going until everyone's child, everyone's brother, everyone's father, everyone's mother, everyone's sister, everyone's daughter is respected, valued, and protected in the United States equally. So until that day comes, the fight continues, the struggle continues, and I hope that I have a chance to have another conversation with Captain Hunter in the future. It sounds like we have a lot more to talk about.